Hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Maija Tanninen-Mattila. I'm the director of the Helsinki Biennial and the director of HAM, the Helsinki Art Museum. Welcome to Biennials in Conversation. Thank you for joining us from near and far. The Helsinki Biennial has invited Dr. Paul O'Neill to create a series of talks on biennials, and this is the last one of 3 events. Today, the focus will be on 3 recent biennials: RIBOCA in Riga, the Goteborg International Biennial for Contemporary Art GIBAC, and the 10th Berlin Biennale. Due to COVID-19, the first edition of the Helsinki Biennial was postponed, and we're very much hoping to open it this summer. The global pandemic has forced us all to rethink the ways we live and work and how we produce biennial events. Here in Helsinki, we are set to install works on the island of Vallisaari this spring when it's possible to do so. We're planning a hybrid model, which will enable us to open the biennial in stages if necessary. Throughout the production, the biennial team will be closely following Finnish government guidelines and acting accordingly. We're creating additional digital content, and this series of talks is one of the many events produced in conjunction with the first edition of the Helsinki Biennial. I want to thank Paul for this collaboration, for creating this series of talks, and for bringing together this great group of guests, curators, and colleagues. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights and time with us today. It is very much appreciated. And now, first, let me introduce Dr. Paul O'Neill, who is an Irish curator, artist, writer, and educator. Between 2013-17, he was director of the graduate program at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College, New York. He has written extensively on the subject of curating, and he is currently the artistic director of Publix, a curatorial agency and event space with a dedicated library and reading room in Helsinki. Publix is known also for its collaborative approach and its para-hosting program. Paul will now give a brief introduction of the structure of the event and will introduce each speaker. We have a great lineup of presentations and discussions, so let's get started. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maija, and thank you to everybody at the Helsinki Art Museum and Helsinki Biennial for inviting me to put together this series of 3 talks, and also for bearing with me over the last 12 months as we tried different ways to gather people together. But welcome everybody, wherever you are, and I'm delighted to be able to share with you some friends, some old friends, some new friends, some old ideas, some new ideas, but ultimately to focus on 3 biennials which have been realized in the last 3 years, and in a way to markate a particular period of time in the interrelationship between globalism and contemporary art. Last time, if you joined us 2 weeks ago, we spent some time at Rocks Media Collective with Matt Packer and Marty Mannin, which focused on 3 different approaches to the Biennale model, but also a focus on 3 different roles: the role of the director, the role of the curator, and the role of the artist or artist curatorial collective. And they were truly global in their reach, from Yokohama to Eva in Ireland to Momentum Nordic Biennial. But this week, we're going to focus on 3 cities, the cities of Berlin, Gothenburg, and Riga, all pre-pandemic, less than an hour, almost less than an hour away from Helsinki. So I think it was important that we focus a little bit on, in a way, the kind of global region of Helsinki Biennial. Also to say that the first lecture, which took place at the very beginning of March, where I contextualize the history of the Biennale model and its parallel development of the globalization of contemporary art. Is also available on the Helsinki Biennial YouTube channel if you wish to do some homework and catch up on some of the thematics, some of the concerns and some of the issues which have been raised over the last few weeks. But this, as I said, this talk will focus on three biennales, three perennial exhibitions in Riga, Gothenburg and Berlin, and look at their divergent approaches to the biennial-perennial exhibition model. We've brought together three incredible curators, Rebecca Lamarche-Vadel, Nav Haq and Gabi Ngcobo, each being the curators of Riga Biennial, RIBOCA in 2020, and the Gothenburg Biennial of Contemporary Art 2017, and the 10th Berlin Biennale 2018. And we will explore how these biennials have challenged the standard perennial exhibition form, but also responding to their particular geopolitical contexts in both time and place. In terms of the structure of today's event, the schedule will follow closely as there will be three 20-minute presentations back to back. I will introduce each speaker one at a time, and we will hopefully at the end of the three presentations gather some questions and have a conversation for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then we will ask our invited respondent, João Lai, from who's the chief curator at Chiasma in Helsinki, to respond to the three presentations, and João will have the final word of today. But you're very welcome, and I would like to firstly introduce in chronological order three biennales. But firstly, I would like to introduce Nav Haq, who was the curator of the 9th Gothenburg International Biennial of Contemporary Art in 2017. And Nav is also the Associate Director of MUCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, and responsible for the artistic program there. He was senior curator at the same institution between 2012 and 2019. Also, Nav has been the founding editor of the online research platform for the Internationale Confederation of European Museums, which has been a great resource for many of us following the development of European museums and some of the conversations happening across Europe in the last few years. But he is also editor of After All, which I just received in the post today, and I think it's a 50th issue today. Congratulations to After All. But Nav was previously exhibitions curator at the Arnold Feeney in Bristol and curator at Gasworks in London. He has organised numerous monographic and group exhibitions across the world, including solo exhibitions with artists such as Hassan Khan, Cosima van Bonnen, Shilpa Gupta, Imogen Stidworthy, and many, many others. And he's also put together some incredible group exhibitions over the last 10 years or so, including Superpower Africa and Science Fiction, which I was lucky to see. Also the Museum Show, a major historical exhibition of semi-fictional museums created by museums in 2011, which I was also lucky to see. And two-person show between Hegu Yang and Felix Gonzalez Torres in 2011. Also with Teardad Solgarder, he co-curated Lapdogs of the Bourgeoisie, which looked at the class and hegemony in contemporary art. So Nav has been responsible for many significant research-oriented or research-led group exhibitions, and has been known for the depth of his inquiry. But today, Nav will focus on the subject of secularity, but also on specifically how that relates to his curation of the Gothenburg Biennial in 2017. So Nav, welcome, and look forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours, or the screen is yours, I should say.
Thanks, Paul. I wish I'd given you a shorter bio. That went on a bit too long. Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about my experience of working on the Gothenburg Biennial which took place in 2017, 4 years ago. So it's not very recent. So this has been a chance to sort of revisit something in a way like one of my sort of bigger projects from the last years, and I suppose given the time that we have, that it will be in kind of like in talking about it in terms of the broad lines. So yeah, and I just will start by saying that it is true that the biennial was citywide. There was maybe sort of two main hubs, two art spaces, the Roderstein Konsthal and the Gothenburg Konsthal as sort of two main hubs, but otherwise there was something like 10 or 11 other venues around the city. So it was, in terms of like this question of format that you raised, Paul, I think it was a chance to explore a kind of urban interface. But I would still probably say overall that the topicality of the project was really, for me, quite really the core of it. It was also a chance to explore, in terms of the topicality, something that I've been interested in for kind of a while, the subject of secularity. And I think it's quite often the case for me that for many of the projects that I work on, there's always like a seed of an idea, and it sort of germinates in the mind, maybe over sort of many years, and then eventually an opportunity comes for it to manifest as a project, and that was the case here with the invitation to be of the 2017 edition. It felt like the good moment and the good opportunity to explore this particular question, which started in the beginning as an exploration of the question of atheism or non-belief, and understanding that there is a kind of plurality of positions when it comes to non-belief. But then it sort of developed into talking about the subject of secularity, which I felt sort of gave more complexity to this question, which is really about how to create the conditions for coexistence of all individuals in society through the provision of social protections, rights, and freedoms. And I think this term secularity is quite abstract, perhaps for a lot of people. But the reality is that it has a sort of big impact on people's everyday life without necessarily people realizing it. Typically, it can be manifested through sort of separation of organized religion and state. But it's something that's played an important role in creating the conditions for regulating often complex and divisive social-cultural issues, including things like sexual freedom, gender equality, and minority rights, freedom of belief, and freedom of expression. But I think the idea of introducing vocabulary into the sort of general consciousness is for me always like an important part of a lot of the work that I do, to sort of introduce vocabulary and notions to help think about what for me is kind of the key questions at this point, being things like what kind of society actually do we want, and also what is the role of art and culture within that. This was sort of a chance to really, rather than sort of explore something very sort of broad and open-ended, to really go sort of directly into a kind of topicality, a specific topicality, and to understand that art, or shall I say artistic imagination, has, I think, an important role to play in this. So, and to understand really secularity as a kind of a mode of ethics, let's say. So I suppose I have to ask for the the images to appear. So if that could start, great. So I mean, I haven't really sort of necessarily synchronized the sort of documentation of the biennial with exactly what I say, because I also always find documentation becomes a bit of a kind of one-dimensional representation of a project compared, of course, to the first-hand experience. But I think it at least give you a kind of visual snapshot of it. So we can already sort of start to move through the images. The title of the biennial, as you saw in the last slide, is Where Do I End and You Begin?, which is actually taken from one of the works in the biennial from Shilpa Gupta, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. But one of the core venues is the Roderstein Konsthal, which is also, the biennial is actually organized out of the Roderstein. And we can go to the next slide. It's basically like and this is the other sort of artistic venue, let's say the Gothenburg Konsthal. So two very different venues, actually. So one a sort of post-industrial art space, and one really sort of a classical exhibition hall. And the next one. So this is sort of let's say sort of a general installation view of a lot of the works exhibited in the Roderstein Konsthal. And I think it's important to really sort of say a bit about the conditions of the biennial, because the Gothenburg Biennial is really not in any way a kind of mega structure. It's actually quite modest. They try and make a lot happen through quite limited means. So I think this scale, which for me I would compare with maybe sort of a large show in a museum such as the one where I work now. It for me, like, this scale is somehow good, or good to bear in mind, because it means that you can be quite focused in this case, focused really in terms of topicality. And I always sort of appreciate, having seen some previous editions of the biennial in Gothenburg in the past, I've always appreciated the fact that it's always tried to contribute to the discourse at the intersection of art and philosophical thought, which for me is quite important in a lot of the work that I do, this sort of relationship with philosophical thought, and how the work of a lot of artistic work can be perceived through a philosophical lens. And so because of this scale and with these sort of limited means, yeah, we can also go to the next slide. Why not? I think it's good to say that the biennial calls itself International Biennial. I think the reality is that it's really hard for it to be really sort of a global exhibition. It can be international, but I would say in terms of scale, the focus is broadly, it can cover really sort of a European scale, just about. So it was maybe a good way to sort of focus also in terms of the topicality on Europe and the European question, and sort of the sort of look at some fundamental questions about civil society in Europe, the formalization of its values, and how it sort of deals with the fine line between protections and violence. Yeah, we can carry on. This is an installation of some works by Basim Magdi, and we can carry on again. An installation by Rose Borthwick, artist living in Gothenburg, and we can carry on again with it. This is a second installation view. Basically, it's a project about the artist's own interface with different faith groups that sort of actively try to, for want of a better word, like recruit members of the public into joining their faith community, including, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientologists, etc. And we can carry on. An installation by Haegu Yang called Series of Vulnerable Arrangements, which for me actually could have been also a perfectly credible title for the biennial, because for me secularity can often be considered a series of vulnerable arrangements, particularly in moments where ideas of national monoculture become particularly strong. Which is certainly has been the case in Sweden from my experience of it, is ideas of national monoculture and what people perceive as being the sort of Swedish self-image. We can carry on. A work by actually Finnish artist Riga Kuopala, a project about sort of tracing the story of her grandparents who were actually missionaries in Namibia. And of course Finland, like Sweden actually, is Lutheran, has sort of strong sort of Lutheran basis, but I suppose it was a way to sort of reflect on the chain of sort of coloniality in terms of spreading the spread of belief, because ultimately also Lutheranism came to Finland from Sweden. We can carry on. Yeah, an installation by Antwerp artist Michel Martin. It's a bit of a complex work to explain, but we can carry on. Next slide. Some works by Etel Adnan, who also sort of developed a practice over several decades that also for me sit at the intersection of art, visual art and philosophical thought. For me, she's really a polymath, also dealing with some quite important social and philosophical questions. And we can go to the next slide. I have kind of a lot, so we can actually sort of move through them quite quickly. So we can, this is the entrance of the Rådhusstern, and we had actually, I should mention that in terms of the format, there was also maybe 2 sub-exhibitions to the biennial. One was a kind of retrospective of works by the Danish artist Jens Horning, an artist who I actually sort of greatly admired, but I personally feel has been a bit underappreciated, and it was a great chance within the biennial to show really, like, I think more than 20 of his works, which was really transversal across different venues in the city and also including public space. And one of the works was his project Foreigners Free. And this was what basically for visitors to the Rådhusstern, people would be asked a question if if they were consider themselves as foreign, and for those that did, they would actually have free entrance. And for me, it was actually kind of a good thing. I was quite happy about to do it in the Rådhusstern, because actually it was the only venue in the biennial charging entrance. All the rest were free. So we were looking at sort of more than sort of 20, 25 years of Jens Horning's work. We can carry on again. And so this here you can see sort of several others works of his, and we can carry on again. A project that he did where he would swap the lights from the sort of the asylum center in the suburbs of Gothenburg with the lights of the Rådhussten Konsthall. And next slide. And maybe the work that sort of first made him internationally renowned, his Turkish jokes project, where here in the sort of public transport intersection, people could hear jokes being told in Turkish. Next slide. I also included several examples of sort of historical, let's say, non-arts material. So here I displayed examples of anti-Semitic cartoons that were published in Swedish press around sort of 100 years previous, in the early part of the 20th century, which was actually kind of a common thing in the sort of national press in Sweden across the ideological spectrum. And this thing of sort of cartoons is, of course, being kind of a divisive subject, particularly in the Nordic region. We can carry on. And again. Yeah, this is a sort of installation shot inside the Gothenburg Konsthall. Yeah, we can carry on once more. And yeah, we can see some works there by Jens Harning, Hegu Yang Gen. We can carry on. And again. An installation work. We were lucky enough to have commissioned quite a few new works for the biennial, and this was a project by Santiago Mostin, artist based in Stockholm. And next slide. And again, a bit more historical. We included these works by Hilma af Klint, which are sort of her books that she would produce. So they're actually quite interesting. So if we go to the next slide. So what you see here is books that she would produce. She made many of these. So what you see on the right is a photograph of one of her paintings. So of course the painting would be very large, but she would take photos. And of course this is pre-color photography. Put them in a book and then make a sort of a watercolor of the painting on the left side. And she would go around, because of course for her, with these paintings based on her theosophical beliefs, they're sort of coming from a higher power. So she would go around and asking people actually, what is the meaning of the painting? So there was a kind of discursive quality to these books. If we carry on. Some works by Fahad Burki, an artist from Pakistan. If we carry on again. And if we carry on again. And once more. Some documentation of Jonas Dahl's project in the to help set up a parliament in the sort of autonomous region of Rojava in Syria. Next slide. Yeah, and next slide. Yeah, there was 10 or 12 projects around the city. So one included a more performance-based work by Public Movement, which was actually people had to book to have a sort of a one-on-one conversation as part of this performance. Next slide. And yeah, this is Shilpa's work, which is a text piece, which functions a little bit like a piece of concrete poetry. So it's quite sort of deliberate that the spaces between the words are removed because it sort of answers the question. Next slide. Yeah, another sort of work by Jonas Dahl, this time a new commission, which is really about sort of how we've replaced religion with new belief system of capitalism. Next slide. This is a project by Maddie Leach, which relates to a murder that happened in a park in Gothenburg during the 90s, committed by the member of a Swedish metal band, Jon Nordtveit, which still somehow important sort of historical reference point in Gothenburg. Next slide. This is a project by, sorry, I have to always remind myself some of the names, by a young Danish painter, Alexander Tovborg, and this was in a church constructed in the so-called National Romantic style in Sweden, where when you're inside, you have the experience of being a bit like you're within a sort of upturned boat. Next slide. And a film by the artist Dmitry Venkov, looking at the situation of migrants from Africa that came to Moscow during the sort of Soviet era as part of the Friendship of Nations program, and how very often they now have to deal with sort of very difficult situation of highly racist society, and it sort of follows the story of a family that eventually sort of seek asylum in Norway, and we presented this in a second-hand store in the city, in the center of the city. Next slide. A project by the Kingdoms of Elgaland, Vagaland, which was, I suppose, reflecting on the idea of sort of nation building, let's say. Next slide. A project by the Swedish artist Francesca Ruiz. The next slide. And I mentioned one sub-exhibition, the project with Jens Horning, but the second one was a kind of overview of video works from the Nordic region, particularly from the period of the 1990s, because I had a sort of strong interest for various reasons on the period of the 1990s for this project. And we presented around sort of 15 or more works, video works in the Gothenburg Central Library, which is actually a very, very dynamic space. I was really fascinated by it, and it was great to insert 20, well, I can't remember exactly, between 15 and 20 works there in the library. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so they were really sort of spread around. And the next slide. And the next one. Yeah, I mean, that's basically ultimately the end of my presentation. And as I say, it's really talking about it in terms of the broad lines. And of course, there's a lot of details there. So I'm happy to answer any questions or have a further discussion about any of the details of that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nav. It was great to see lots of images of an exhibition that I have also experienced, and it brought me back in many ways. There are a number of questions that have been pitched towards you, which I'll from the audience, which I will return to at the end of the three presentations. But I think many of the issues that you brought up around scale and focus and the modest nature of the scale of the Biennale and how it enabled you to focus on a particular thematic such as secularity, which you define as modes of ethics or belief systems that are not tied to any religious form of religious belief, I think is very interesting. But I think there's also within your narrative a number of things which you perhaps left out, such as the issue of controversy and what wasn't allowed or what you felt wasn't permitted in relation to kind of non-belief systems and belief systems and so forth. But I think this is something that we can maybe return to again. And I also really liked the fact that you showed some of the citywide interventions, which may have been quite modest in scale in terms of their interventions, but I think very important to visitors to the city to experience different spaces and how they were activated by the presence of the particular commissions, which I think were very, very carefully considered in terms of the site specificity of the work and content. But thanks, Nav. We'll come back to when we have our discussion a little bit later on. I'm delighted to introduce our second guest this afternoon, this morning, which is Gabi Ngcobo, who is an artist, curator and educator living in Johannesburg in South Africa. Gabi, since the early 2000s, has been engaged in collaborative research, curatorial and educational projects in South Africa, but also internationally. Most recently has curated the project All in a Day's Eye, the politics of innocence in the Javet family collection at the Javet Art Centre in Pretoria. But also Gabi will focus primarily, I believe, on the 10th Berlin Biennale, which has one of my favorite titles of any Biennale, We Don't Need Another Hero. But Gabi is also familiar to many of you as an internationally recognized curator, but also co-curator of the 32nd Sao Paulo Biennale in 2016. So very familiar to the Biennale models of different scales and sizes. But I'm delighted to invite Gabi to take the stage. Gabi, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible.
It's fine for me.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. Also to revisit an event that feels, although it was a few years ago, it feels like it was a long time ago because so much has happened in a year. And of course, we all think about how we could potentially doing the works that we do differently now. So I also will kind of like engage in a process of trying to piece together put together the pieces of working in Berlin. Coming from South Africa, and some of the strategies, I'm not going to go through them, that me and my team kind of built in order to build, I guess, a narrative of the Biennale, which was not meant to be coherent at all. So, of course, my first instinct coming to do the Biennale in Berlin was to build a team. I was also thinking about what this team could potentially represent, and I wanted people who are coming from kind of diverse perspectives. So Nomaduma Masilela, for example, who has been a researcher at historian based in the US, with also kind of like complex, personal history of kind of movement from different places, and who is also like South African, half Polish, born in Berlin, lived in the US, and what that position and how she's positioned her career could potentially bring to the Biennale. Yvette Mutumba, who's also an historian and curator and writer, living in Berlin, was also quite critical because, of course, she's somebody who has been navigating spaces in Berlin and in Germany as she had come from Frankfurt. At the Weltkartoon before that, and many other places. Moses Serubiri Moses, who's also a curator from East Africa, Uganda, who's living in New York, as well as Tiago de Paula Souza from Brazil, and somebody that I had met when I was working in Sao Paulo. And to me, these people were bringing, kind of like complex and interesting viewpoints from where they had been placed before, and also people that had crossed along the way and have had conversations with that I wished to continue within a framework, or to see what happens when we build something like a Biennale together. And one of the things that I was interested in, the distribution of resources. So I come from some example, and so for me that this is interesting. I've been able to navigate the world and which kinds of fundings are available for certain subjectivities or abilities was something of interest to me. So for example, when I understood that there was a budget for curatorial research, I invited Tiago to come with me to the research of curatorial research to 6 Caribbean islands, and also to kind of this visit to decide also even on which island, kind of like based on information that we get from different people, and also trying to see if when moving from one island to another, if we can avoid, for example, flying to Miami, which had been the case and still the case for many of these still, and I must say that we managed to do that. And why the Caribbean? Because it had been interesting for me that as a South African person, this kind of network or connection has not, in my career, has not been possible before, because of these funding streams that are directed, mainly from the West, kind of deciding or based on the West interest of what is interesting, of what is the focus. So kind of like take this thing and go to a place that I would otherwise not be able to was very interesting for me. Of course, meeting people and keeping the schedule as open and not filled as possible, allow for the chance and also to relationships that would last beyond those few days spent in each place. Another strategy that we set up resident collaboration with different races to invite artists to go to places, not so that they can work inspired by but those kind of to scenes, to practice, and these residents they will inspired by artists were already doing in their practices, and kind of see what these places could potentially do, not immediate, but perhaps on a longer term. So from we're going to Bangladesh. We had 3 artists from Berlin, from Benin, from Haiti, from Port-au-Prince, yes, and as well as going to Johannesburg from Brazil, and also with the public program. So we decided to see program before the start, and the reason for that was really working in Berlin. One was working in a place that it has so many active and activated agent, which have to do with representation, decoloniality, changes, and kind of how we were interested in kind of recognizing this that were already in place in a place like Berlin, in order to find how we could then be situated, not to erase those processes, but to to perhaps bring another layer to it. So the public program also, we invited Donna Kukama, who's a performance artist from South Africa, Jota Mombasa, writer, and also an artist from Brazil. 2 poems, Each One Teach One, which was the space, a library and a space in Wedding that we collaborated with towards this event, and also other public programs going forward, as well as George Shearer. What was interesting about Each One Teach One is that it's a space that had existed in Berlin, and I think what interested us was that it is foremost a library. So it is a library built from the books and other collectibles of one person who was an Afro-German person, and very interesting book, of course, also to collect more books. And so as a curator team, we look at these books, scanned the covers, about 300 of these books, and kind of like we were showing them as a kind of a film. In that, also trying to just say, so much information out there, so much of what we, of the world has been addressed by so for over 100 years, and in that case, where can we, as the team, be landing? Because we were trying to avoid, beginning from the beginning, but to kind of find a space of continuity, like and so a grammar of the and to be an event of knowledge that is also not didactic. So the idea of the public program being told, I'm not who you think I'm not, and also the exhibition being titled, We Don't Need Another Hero. I mean, we were interested in this, in creating a public program that activates at distances, that distances us from perceived notions of who we are, also that reconfigures, ideas of knowledge or the hierarchies within those knowledge systems. Also an event that redistributes, especially responsibility. And because there's always a notion that some people need to take care of certain questions, and other people don't have to take of those questions because they're perceived that those questions don't affect them necessarily. What was also interesting for us was that the Biennale had reached its 20th year of being active. So there's also an anniversary version of the Biennale. But also the question would be, how does one commemorate? And of course the answer to that would be what perhaps doesn't, or kind of like brings the idea of play. But in this case, I have always been interested in institutions, in the critique of institutions. I like institutions a lot, and had a lot of relationships with institutions. I've set up platforms in Johannesburg, such as NG, I think it's organized, and the Center for historical reenactments together with other people. That are platforms that really try to kind of understand, not understand institution, how, you know, what a new institution could potentially like, and do we place ourselves also within institutions. So of course the institution of the Berlin Biennale then therefore interested me, and we invited Marcel, who has been doing these portraits of institutions in Brazil, and so far she had done 4 of her titled Legendaries, to do a bit of Biennale, and of course Kunstwerke, because those histories are intertwined. And this was quite interesting, because then you start to about the institution, bring people together who were there in the 90s, starting the institution in Cape, and creating and 14 of that, so that the institution be able to self. The institution in a city, what does it mean to rate a year? So it was a 10. And I think the idea of a crossroads was helped by the fact that the Berlin Biennale, so we used the X of the 10 kind of symbolize also that the cross, as well as the of the Biennale, which was, you know, which were a fiction that we you know, like between the pinks and the grays, pink being the color of the future and gray being the color of history. So in doing so, we kind of created camouflage, which, you know, a space of refusal to kind of face maybe of thinking of things, you know, are different, of rethinking which we talk about things. I was about like that we keep saying the same things that other people saying for years, and how do we dislodge ourselves from this of always feeling like you're always starting from the beginning. Also of the events that really influence the Biennale, or my thoughts also around the Biennale, my personal around the Biennale, and therefore also we don't need another. Here was the movement happened in South Africa, where students 15 protested in the University of Cape Town against of Cecil John Rhodes had been at the university for 80 years. It's a protest that lasted for a month until the university decided to take down the statue. Therefore, kind of activating a different language of protest. One I had since we were fighting for freedom or towards democracy, the time which I of so to speak. So there was this the language that was activated through protest, and I was also thinking about the podium, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes been sitting, which was left and it wasn't removed, as a space of possibilities, of the things that we couldn't for because they had been blocked by this huge piece of bronze, and what could that then that future look like, and also the venue choices wanted us to look at different kinds of institutions, with KW being already an institution that was set for the Biennale, but also to look at a very, very old institution, European institution, which is academic Kunst, and think about the archives that are within this institution and how we could potentially enter them, because it's impossible to know every single thing that is in the archive. But for example, to look for any written material or research around the Haitian revolution, for example, was an entry point, of which we did not find anything, which then became also a starting point to approach that institution, because that institution existed when the revolution took place in Haiti. And so in the exhibition, there were these entries, so the portraits of the Berlin Biennale KW team at Cave, the work of Firarley Baez, which looks at the history and the silenced history of the Haitian Revolution, kind of welcoming you before you even enter the academy. So you kind of enter the academy through that work, and also at ZKU as a place that thinks about urbanity, and so kind of like, grouping also works that think about, land, space, spatiality, and its histories and all its problematic histories, but also activating through our program spaces like May Ayim Ufa, of which the Berlin Post-Colonial, which is a group of people in Berlin who are active in rethinking or helping also the city, and also protesting against certain names that are understood to be problematic historical figures, and so there were all these kind of connections, making the Biennale. And for us, it was really important that the Biennale is not coherent in a way. It has a starting point that is connected to this. Then it becomes, after that, sort of like a dreamscape of sorts, that there's things that make sense, and then those things be broken, but it depends on your body and your body of nature, and the experience of the Biennale is kind of from all those different angles in a way that is also not confrontational, in a way that is also kind of poetic, and also very much interested in investing, if it would be possible, to large scale event, not only one that can diagnose in a way, that can diagnose the problems of what we are we're suffering from, rather than be too big and try to solve the problems, but kind of like point at certain problems that perhaps we didn't see in one particular. So to open avenues of kind of different. And I think I'm going to end there and look forward to a quick Q&A later.
Thanks, Gabi. I just letting you know that there was the audio wasn't perfect throughout that, so I only picked up on maybe 90% of what you said, but I think there were a number of key points that you brought up in relation to the specificity of the Berlin Biennale, but also how, as an institution, there are also some questions to be asked about how it learns from itself over time, being in its 20th year, when you created a 10th Biennale, like what kind of learning and unlearning took place. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the incredible team that you brought together for the Biennale, and maybe there's some kind of space for reflecting upon that, the necessity for bringing together a research team or a curatorial team, and what that means to kind of decenter the authorship in a way. I also really appreciate the lack of coherence, or the rejection of coherence, that was very key to the Biennale for somebody who experienced it. There were moments of coherence like that were certainly for me experienced across the various venues and across the various works. Different narratives emerged over time, but I really like the idea of the dreamscape, which allows different stories, different temporalities, and different connections to emerge over time. But I think also the incredible layering of the Biennale, which I think many people appreciated, 2.5 years ago, and the different layers that the kind of public program instigated in terms of the mediation process, but also the learning and unlearning through the kind of school activities, school of anxiety activities, as well as the exhibition itself. So I think that's maybe something else to reflect upon, the relationship between the exhibition as one kind of experience, and then these other moments of mediation and learning and communication that happens within the parallel programs. Maybe we can return to some of those issues after we hear from our final speaker, our final presenter, I should say, this afternoon. So I'm delighted to introduce Rebecca Lamarche-Vadel, who is the director of Lafayette Anticipation Foundation in Paris. And Rebecca has created many shows over the last 10 years or so, but will focus primarily on the 2020 edition of the, also known as RIBOCA, which was the second Biennale to take place in Riga, and its title being "And Suddenly It All Blossoms," which also will be a feature film and will premiere in 2021. I believe Rebecca's also going to show us a small clip or trailer or teaser for that film. But it's important to say that RIBOCA was one of the few biennales to take place during the pandemic, during the early months of the pandemic, I would say, even in 2020. And but I'm very grateful for Rebecca, with a very little space to reflect between last year and this year, to come and talk to us today. And Rebecca has curated many shows across the world, and was appointed as the co-curator of Voyages d'Hiver à Château de Versailles, and also collaborated on many occasions with international institutions such as MoMA, PS1, the Stedelijk, and Nottingham Contemporary. But welcome, Rebecca, who's joining us from Paris, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Very happy to talk with you today. I mean, to have a monologue with you today that I hope to transform into a dialogue, of course. So maybe we could start with the presentation. So yeah, well, that's impressive as a start. Now, I wanted basically to introduce you to the general idea of this project that, of course, got completely, that collapsed completely on its way, because this project I had been working on for a few years before it was supposed to happen last year. It was scheduled for May 2020, and in March everything collapsed. The borders started to close, and we very fast understood that we had to either decide to cancel the project or to find some creative and resilient ideas to maintain this project. And the second option became the most relevant one because of the topic of the show itself. So the topic of the show was about reenchantment. Reenchantment being, or starting from the idea of understanding whatever we're surrounded by and with in different ways, trying to overcome this human exceptionalism in which we have a tendency to post ourselves, and very inspired by the Baltic and the Latvian scene that I discovered, trying to find other ways of building relationships, of giving attention, of giving dignity, of giving recognition to non-humans, but also other humans who have been silenced or who remained invisibilized. Basically, this project started really from my research on site, so I was not really familiar with Riga and the Baltic scene before I started to work on the project, but my way of working is that I really go on site and kind of all of these conversations that I had with artists, with theorists, with researchers, kind of brought together a cloud of words, of a zeitgeist, of values, of certain beliefs that I thought were relevant to engage with. And this came out, so you can go to the next one. Yeah, that's the title, and suddenly it all blossomed, that I will explain if I have time. If you go again, next one. Yeah, so it all started as well from traditions, oral traditions that are extremely important in the Baltic states and Latvia, which are the dainas. Dainas is oral poetry that has been passed along by women mainly since the 60th century, and they're kind of haiku of sorts. There are millions of them that have been counted, and they are always trying to put together a hypothesis of new relationships that can be built between humankind and cosmic rhythms, natural rhythms, seasonal rhythms, and so on. I was also very inspired by the presence of calendars that are still and the schedule of the year that is still extremely present in the culture, and that is very much linked with celestial rhythms such as LIGO, which is a very important moment that is about to arrive in June in Latvia, and which celebrates the summer solstice, and which is like an incredibly important marker in the year and this understanding of time passing. These are just a few. I mean, I could name the Baltic Way as well, maybe, which was extremely important. It was in 1989. This 600 kilometers chain of humans who did chant together to ask for the revolution. It was a very peaceful, like, manifesto asking for the end of the USSR and oppression. So all of this really led me to this thinking about, okay, Riga, Latvia, and the Baltic states, but especially Latvia, has been through centuries and centuries of oppression, of colonization, through since its beginning in the 13th century, but still has maintained and nourished this very strong link and bonds with ecosystems. And this idea of ecosystems, and however toxic they are, however dangerous they are, however undiscussable, so that celestial rhythms still exist. And this was basically the idea that I really wanted to think about, is like worlds have ended many times in Latvia, but still, like, every time the end of a world, the end of an identity, the end of certain values didn't mean the end of the world. And so this idea of the end of a world was really crucial to the exhibition from its inception. So maybe you can go to the next one. Next slide. Yeah. So the idea was really to not re-enchantment. By re-enchantment, I mean, again, like readdressing a certain way of doing relationships, not necessarily positive, it's like, and suddenly it all blossoms. The title is about something blossoming, but we don't really know what it is, right? The it in this title is absolutely crucial to think about this idea of a rebirth, but that is yet to be named or yet to be called for. But the idea was to really be pragmatic, to really meet whatever was surrounding us. And so when thinking about the site and doing kilometers and kilometers in the city, visiting every art institution, every place devoted to art and creation, but also more like mundane or secular places, it struck me that what was needed for this project was really to engage in the city and in a particularly noticeable place, which is André Sala. So it's a district. So on the left here, you see like that's a district that is incredibly close to the historical center of Riga that you see. There's a bit yellow next to the Daugava. So it's like, I think 10 minutes walk, actually I know it's 10 minutes walk from the hypercenter of the city, which you see on the right image. But and this district has been closed since 89 to the city. So it's been like privatized and it belongs to private owners, and so it's like extremely central, yet doesn't exist at all anymore in the inhabitants and citizens' mental landscapes. And we can go to the next one because I will go through so you have an idea. The next, yeah. So this is a place, it's like a former industrial port, which since its inception is made as a place of contradiction, or a place that was kind of entangling the questions I wanted to deal with, because André Sala started from the 15th century when like there was lots of flooding in the city of Riga, and so they started to build kind of huge architectural structures to try to avoid flooding and to avoid the power of natural strength, and they started to build throughout the centuries, and eventually, like because of this, some islands started to show up in the Daugava, and André Sala, which means the island of André, is one that was like born through this relationship and this complex relationship built between humans and non-humans. So here you see, and we can go next to we can go through this site. So you will see this is an enormous site that is 1,000 square meters. That was really like calling or inviting to think about what we inherit. Here we inherit like this massive land, obviously. Most of it is toxic and has been polluted by industrial activities. You have massive hangars that you see there that used to be the storage for massive production and that today are empty. You have behind an industry that just stopped to produce this year. If you go on, you have this paintball. That was a place that was like strikingly inspiring when I visited it, because it was still working, and so you had people basically playing to shoot themselves with painting, which is, as a curator, always a site of interest. Then you can go next. Yeah, this is another vision of this. So this is a church, for example, belonging to this paintball. And here you see the growing of new ecosystems. You had like lots of species, like maybe animal or vegetal, that were starting to grow and take back the power and the site, basically. If you go on. Yeah, and this is one of, the main venue, which is like the port building, which is this absolutely massive warehouse. I think you have to imagine the kind of disorientation that the Tate produces if you've ever been to the Tate. It's like, of course, this huge turbine hall and this feeling of your humanity being interrogated by the space you're in, because it's like somehow completely disconnected with our human scale. And I was very interested in this because it was really what we inherit and what we don't know what to do with, because André Sala and this building especially is like completely empty and at times working. So you can go down with some trains that were bringing some materials and bringing them up. It was like absolutely, you can go next. On its way. Yeah, so this is like one of the production is like wood that was stored there, but like so many stories that were told and that I wanted to engage with. But most importantly, I wanted to reopen this territory to people in Riga, in Latvia, for those for whom it would matter, because this district was a very important one in the history of the city itself. It used to be a place where people would go raving, would have parties and so on, and was kind of taken away by yet another world ending, which was the end of the USSR. And my question, or what I wanted to inquire on with the works and with them inhabiting this space that was like outside, inside, that was not an artistic place or not devoted to this activity, like what would happen and how would it react. So you can go on. yeah, this is like inside this warehouse. So you see these massive volumes. Oh, story next. I'm waiting for you to move, and so you can go next. Yeah. And so what happened is that we were about to open. It was March. It was mid-March. The show was like this install was starting, and of course the lockdowns and the borders started to close. And very soon we met with Anastasia and Agnia in charge of the biennial, and thought about what we should do. And of course, this exhibition was about the limit of our powers, like about how to acknowledge in an idea of new ways of being humans, how to acknowledge our fragility, our humility, how we're decentering from things. And we had here like a virus, which is one of the smallest forms of life, that was putting our entire civilization into its knees. And it seemed like quite obvious that, to be fair and to be kind of relevant with the project of this idea of the end of the world is not the end of the world, but also what happened when you're acknowledging basically all of the difficulties and complexities that are surrounding you. We had to morally almost like go on and pursue this project. But in March, we had no idea about what would happen in the months to come. So I proposed that we would shoot a movie. And that basically we would mount the exhibition as much as we could, and we would try to stick to the project, the new project that we had to design, because many things remained impossible to pursue. And we would film a movie that would be kind of the only witness of this in the case where we could not open the exhibition. So try to transform this into an hybrid object that would at least be able to reach people who wouldn't be able to come. So I called it an exhibition de catastrophe. Sorry, I Frenchized a bit this expression, but the idea was really to become very porous. The whole world was in a state of catastrophe, in a state of shock, in a state of resilience, where a huge need of reinvention was felt, a huge need of solidarity, of finding new ways, new solutions, and I tried and I decided to embrace the show this way, to embrace our ghost, to embrace our the death of the former ideal project and desires, and to really acknowledge like everything that fell through and that we as a team had to say goodbye to. So you can go to the next one. First and foremost, we acknowledged every change as much as possible. Here you see the exhibition guide, and you don't really see it, but like you have most of the initial ideas about the artworks like were crossed but remain visible, and you have in orange the new version that we had to do and that we had to produce. If you go to the next one. So I will go through some works that will give you examples, like very concrete examples of what happened. This is Lifetime, so it's a piece by Ugo Rondinone, which was supposed to be a neon poem, a rainbow poem that was stored in Switzerland, and as all borders were closed, we could not ship it. So I discussed one by one with every artist from the show when everything collapsed, and we decided to find solutions, or at times not be able to find solutions, and also accept that. In this case, Ugo accepted that we would replace his work by a trompe-l'œil and do a plywood work of the original one. So this is basically a fake real Ugo Rondinone that was done on plywood, and that was like hand painted days and night by a team of painters in Riga, who reproduced the original piece that actually we never saw, that I never saw, and that Riga never saw as well. But now this piece belongs to the city, and Ugo has offered it also as a memory of this very special moment. You can go to the next one. Heinz Frank was like. Also, sorry, I have to go so quick, but the whole exhibition was built as an odyssey. So there was a big narration, and this piece of Ugo Rondinone that we just saw was basically the first piece that would welcome you, and you would have to go through this rabbit hole, a bit like Alice in Wonderland, to go through this wall and kind of discover the exhibition that would unfold for a walk of 3 or 4 hours in the best case. So it was really about also feeling other rhythms as a visitor, and as a human beings, be much less violent in a way with the bodies of the visitors, who could like stop, who could just have moments in the gardens, who could really transform this time into their own time. And Ugo Rondinen was a bit of the riddle that would welcome you lifetime, which is the question of what do you do with your time? Is this time given to you? How do you spend it? Do you invest it? Do you enjoy it? And what is it as a value and as a material? Heinz Frank here, to just explain to you about this idea of exhibition, the catastrophe, was supposed to be original drawings from Heinz Frank, who sadly passed away 2 days after the opening. And these drawings, you can go to the next one, are dedicated to architects to encourage them to build the world and to build structures and monuments in the world in a much more chaotic way, much less symmetrical, much less classical in a historical sense, and embrace wildness, embrace chaos, embrace incoherence as well. We were talking about that earlier. And this, for example, we could not have the original drawings. So as a curator in a biennial, I had to do something that I never thought I would do, which was to show photocopies. So this is a copy, a color copy of the original drawings, and we could only show that. So this is what we had to present. You can go to the next one. This is Thomas Saraceno. So Thomas Saraceno, we could not have a spider web. So he's very interested in spider webs and the power as allegories of the mysteries of dark matter, but also as instruments of perceptions that far outreach the human perceptions. And we could not ship it. So Thomas asked me like several days before the show, he was like, can you find a spider web in the space? And I looked everywhere in the spaces, everywhere. There was nowhere to find like a relevant or convincing spider web. And one day the elevator, the big elevator, like collapsed, which was terrible in terms of install scheduling. But I just passed in front of it to go to the stairs, and suddenly I saw this man working in the engine room of this elevator, and I looked again and again and again, and I saw what you see here badly, but in reality it's this absolutely amazing, stunning cathedral of spider webs that were just there, like lasting for I guess a decade or more, and that were exactly what we were looking for, and this we were able to engage with and to insert 3 days before the opening of the show, also because in this idea of the exhibition, the catastrophe, anything was welcome, coming from the outside world, inside world. We were really trying to engage, and I was really trying to engage with the accidents, with the aleatory, and try to see how we could build something that would make sense or not make sense actually out of this, but accept this reality as something that we would just put together and welcome. So you can go to the next one. Oliver Beer is another example. You can show the next one. We could not ship like two-thirds of the work, which were objects belonging to his family, and that are objects that he manages to make sing, because like each of them, because of their empty space inside, has some special resonances that humans cannot hear, and he's able through certain tone and frequencies to reach them and make them audible for us. But we were unable to make half of the works come, so we presented this ghost kind of, it's like an empty stage that would always remain empty, while the picture just before, if you can come back, was the objects that belong to Aspesia, who's a very important and theatrical author from Latvia, and of course what her belongings were in Riga, so we were able to present them. And this of course asks a lot about the question of locality and the question of agency when you're working with a locality and like objects that you would find there. And this is what saved the biennial. I think is that 80% of the works, if not more, were produced on site with people from Riga and abroad. You can go to the next and to the next. Yeah, sometimes we had to acknowledge that we could not do anything. and then the space remained empty, such as for Felicia Atkinson, who wanted to do an installation that we never managed to finish, produce, and ship. And so we only had here a voice that was like basically an homage that Felicia did, and that was a kind of a ghost voice that was inhabiting this space. You also see here that the scenography, so the wall, were not finished. We also had on the ground, everywhere where we were supposed to have rooms and nothing could be finished, we had like marks, like basically acknowledging the traces again of what we were hoping for, and where everything fell down, literally, how plants. So if you go to the next one. Augustas Serapinas is another example of things falling down, but this is more to show that this process was integrated a bit before actually this crisis. So Augustas Serapinas was aiming to do a work that would consist in, during the winter, hide and spot families who would do winter snowmen in the gardens and so on. And there was like a kind of a crew of snowman hunters who would just take them as they were done, just after they were finished by the family, but secretly, of course, take them for a few hours, copy them completely, scan them, put them back where they were taken, of course, and during the summer, like do a big exhibition of all of these moments that were moments of poetry between individuals and whatever is provided by natural resources such as snow. But that year, so last year, the winter was one of the warmest ever. It was an historical winter where no snow was to be found. And so we had to reinvent another ritual somehow, because we were seeing our own ritual, our own bounds and relationships and creativity that were invented between human and non-human activities already being threatened by global warming and so on. So this is basically the new snowman that Augustas had to come up with, which is hay and soil, men. You can go to the next one. Yeah, and this is another example of welcoming things that we could not really control. So one of the work that we will see a bit later in the show was the work of Bridget Polk. I invited many artists who are not so-called artists, who are people who developed certain abilities, certain practices that I think we could call artists, but who would in modern contemporary taxonomy would be named outsiders, or outsiders, which is a category that I really despise for many reasons that I cannot really explain for a long time here. But my idea was like, okay, if we decenter the discourse, if we really think about like acknowledging other presences, we have to somehow also act this way into the art world too. And so I invited Bridget Polk. Bridget Polk is a woman who started 10 years ago to do a practice of balancing rocks, which is a practice that is close to meditation and which is about finding a very impossible balance between rocks that would stand together absolutely magically, but without sticks, without glue, without anything, but patience, presence, and concentration and attention that is given to those rocks that are found everywhere around Riga, and basically Bridget was performing every day, and one day we went behind the hangar where she was performing, and basically the whole visitors had started a counter exhibition where all of them had taken her storage stones that were just like next to this site and started to also like try on and practice these balancing rocks by themselves. And this was absolutely welcome. I mean, this amongst many other things that happened that were absolutely not planned. But I think like when you think about a porous exhibition that is welcoming other forces and energies to have agency, this was like a gift for me. This was like almost too beautiful to be true. So you can go to the next one. Yeah. So, of course, we had no vision, as I told you, no idea of what would come up in the next months. We were doing a crazy bet, thinking like, okay, maybe we will be able to install this show. Maybe it will be open, but absolutely no guarantee. What can we do? And so I proposed that we would do this movie that would be based on the show, because for me it was super important that we would, as much as possible, stick to our engagement to the artists and to the different communities in Riga and the team, of course, of the Biennial. And that we would still think about this project that wanted to think about the situation we were living, which was the end of the world. And so we started to put together plans, and I invited Davis Simonis, who's a Latvian director, to join the project, and he did an amazing job. You have to imagine that this is in several weeks we're speaking about. Well, I had to write the script. I had to put together the whole architecture of the movie and how the exhibition would inform it, but also, how this would be an exchange and a hybrid object that we would create. And Davis did put together all of the team and did lots of rehearsal on site and so on. So it was, and I didn't have any guarantee that I would even be able to be on site. So we decided that we would open only for 3 weeks in August, which would, these 3 weeks, be the time that we would need to shoot this movie. And if we could open to the visitors, it would be fantastic. But if we could not, we would have something remaining that would acknowledge this moment of not total despair, but like total disorientation, but also what could we do with it. So you can go to the next one. Next slide. Or not? Yes, thank you very much. So this is Bridget Park, who I was telling you about, and this is what you would see when you would visit the exhibition. It was us, basically, the movie team, shooting this movie. So here you see Bridget, who was doing her performance. You see here around like all of her balancing rocks. The thing with these balancing rocks is like you don't know how long they will last. They can last from 3 seconds to 3 minutes, but most of the time it's 3 weeks or 3 months. They really hold this mystery of like being together, and of course is an allegory for worlds being built, and how long they will last we have no idea, and they will eventually collapse. But it's also a work of acceptance of this potential collapse. So here you can go to the next one. You can see us with Bridget. Bridget was one of the few artists who could come. So we did also like all of the install in distance, which is extremely weird. And I guess anyone from you familiar with the art world and with installing a show might have enjoyed this pleasure this year or last year. And it's an exercise of profound trust, but also delegation. And in some case, like with Bridget, we could really embrace and work together on this project, which was, of course, this ideal situation, but which for many, many artists, I just had to call for their trust and collaboration, distant collaboration. You can go to the next one. So here you see that the team was there, the material was there, the visitors were there. So we had many, many visitors actually in the run of the 3 weeks who rediscovered this district that I was telling you about, and who reappropriated it completely, but who also witnessed us and we became objects of this exhibition too. I myself, like the team, became things that everyone could look at, or like we were kind of objects present and having a certain aim in this exhibition. And for me, it was a very interesting way of kind of a healing process for all of us team to try to do something with that, and everyone from the outside being able to watch this kind of fight to make something happen, or to heal all of the ones that could have happened in the process. Can go to the next one. Yeah, and for example, this brought us to a very funny moment where the stones of Bridget would fall. It was impossible to make them fall. They were way too solid, although they are made to break because nothing holds them together. So we ended up having to have Bridget with like invisible wires, desperately trying to break them at the moment where the camera was coming, and you will see that scene later. But and all of this was also happening during the exhibition hours. So there was like this very interesting mix of performance that we were not really intending to provide, but that happened and that we also were happy to let happen. You can go to the next one. Yeah, we had also like this filming like let us transform the exhibition in really a place that was activated, because many of the works were performance based or had a moment of activation. So this is a piece by Nina Bayer, and Nina Bayer was really thinking about this question of relationships, and wanted to engage with the community of stray cats that was living in this place. And so here she was providing milk in these lions, marble lions that are like domestic allegory for powers and very bourgeois and rich house, and this idea of wildness, and here two ideas of wildness meeting, and this milk that was put in this lion was kind of an invitation, but also a kind of trap for this cat, and which became a scene also for the movie. You can go to the next one. So this is kind of the atmosphere that you would encounter during the movie. So very strange as well, because these presences that are quite unusual in this exhibition, that are traditionally very still objects that tend, as we have inherited them as objects, to be very still, to be very authoritarian, to be very hierarchical. And then here, like, people were the possibility, the position of the visitor, of the viewer, of the filmmakers, and so on, were very entangled, and like a very new choreography was happening between visitors and all of us, and the artists and the artworks, which was also interesting in this time where with the pandemic, all positions were kind of reshuffled, and all former power, structural powers were also not disentangled, unfortunately, but shaken. You can go to the next one. So this is another scene from Nina Bayer, where she had just outside this piece, like this Range Rover cars that are really like symbolizing this idea of power, of mastering nature, of getting very close to nature, in the advertising of this car, but also like while bringing you very close to it, destroying it completely. And so this is again this question of relationships and the complexity of relationships and toxic eventually relationships. So this was another scene that we shot for the movie as well. You can go to the next one. So here is a work by Catherine Ornac, that was activated by teenagers who were sculpting this clay and kind of letting this unconsciousness happen and transform the shape of this million years of clay. And Catherine Ornac was also very interested by this moment of transition of teenage time, where you're like transitioning between one state to the other. And she was interested in the relationship we did build with clay. I have to be very short in the way I speak to you about the works. I hope it's not too reducive. Can you go to the next one, please? Ben Digiske was a saxophonist who I invited and who was luckily on site, and so who invested the space as well. And this is one scene that we shot in the exhibition space. You can go in the next one, sorry. Dora Budor is another example of reinvention. So Dora Budor was intending to do a performance with only a crowd of humans that would like kind of haunt the territory of André Sala, as she was very interested in the concept of background silhouettes in movies. And this idea of suddenly like all of the crowd that usually are behind the heroes would suddenly like go and take the scene. But of course, having a crowd of humans in the times of pandemic proved to be quite complex, and so Dora, in a great exercise of transformation, proposed that we would replace, following also USSR history, where many dogs were replacing humans for some scientific research and experiments. We would replace humans with those. And so here is our director, our scene director that you see on the left side, who was holding the GoPro and who was filming the other species, her companions, that are on the right side. And this is one scene of the movie that has been basically shot by the dog, and of course played by the dogs. And this was also an idea of transforming perspectives and positions and power structure, of course, of us humans always holding the cameras. What would happen when we would shift it and give it away to the dogs? You can go to the next one. Dominica Orzovi is also a piece that we could not finish. So we had only this glass work that we were able to show, and the rest was shown at the same time in an exhibition in Warsaw at the Raster Gallery, but we were unable to ship the work. So what we managed to do is to basically transform the work, or like really make it very cinematographical for the moment of shooting this movie. So you see here the work on the light coming through, and this actress who was basically an actress who was a whipper, a professional whipper, because all of this work of Dominica was about death and the question of disappearance and the way we are dealing with death and absence and disappearance in Western cultures, and the way we hide it or not accept it, and what it means to transfer this sorrow or these emotions to a professional, knowing that this culture of whipping and of embodying the sorrow is one that is to be found in many cultures and not only Western ones. But this is a scene that was enhanced or possible because of the movie that required like an actress. You can go to the next one. Yeah, this is again like this is the entrance of the show. So we were here having a a performance happening every day by Agnes Ecrivadel. And this performance was about the question of aims or believing, and we had a presence of some humans, performers who were here, like spread within this space, like all the time. Actually, would welcome without welcoming the visitors, and this is a part of the shooting of this scene. You can go to the next one. Yeah, here you see I wanted to show you different settings that were really transforming all of us into an object of attention somehow, or because of being, in this movie and performing this movie. And so what I found really interesting with what this pandemic allowed is like lots of freedom to transform the format of the exhibition itself and its experience and its deployment into something very unusual that still today, when I look at these images, I have the feeling that I'm facing something like very unusual that I have not yet coined in every way, in the way I could speak about it, because this was really opening up for like a very emergency situations and solutions. So the exhibition, the catastrophe, was really that, like, what can we do? This thing is kind of fragile, is escaping us, like the exhibition and the initial project it's falling apart. What can we do to kind of retain it? And the movie was one option. You can go to the next one. Yeah, and I guess that's the excerpt. So I will just introduce you quickly to the excerpt. And the whole movie as a concept was that we would never do a documentary, because the idea was absolutely not to try to put an objective or distant understanding of what was happening in such extreme times, but more like use and growth thanks to every work that would be displayed in this exhibition, and really have them as guides of this odyssey that is a bit of an existential odyssey, following the theme of the biennial, of this question of reenchantment and relationships and ways of being human. And so I wrote a voiceover, which is a voiceover of I don't really like the idea of zeitgeist, because I find it way too all-encompassing, but still we had like some remaining questions that were coming back and uncertainties that were coming back in the situation that were there, that were very present. And so this voice is kind of leading you through all of this wonder. The wonder follows the initial wonder that you would have while going through the biennial. So from the first work encounter to the last one. And it's not directly commenting on it, but rather asserting questions that are raised or that are being awakened thanks to the work. So really, what I really tried to do was to remain as faithful as possible to the artworks, and to not have them as like background stories, but really main characters. And the idea was like, okay, how can I think about these artworks as as characters, as voices, that we have to make audible for humans, of course, and use then language. But how can everything start from them and rebound from them and echo from them, following the idea that right now artists can and should and can be understood as the ultimate guides we have for alternative ways of building and putting together worlds. So here you will see a very short excerpt that is kind of not made of the final scenes. It's like very early on. The movie is going to be finished in the next weeks. But I wanted to give you a small idea of what we did, and I hope that you will be able to see in a way or another. So you can play the excerpt. Voilà, I think I will finish there because I don't have much more to add, and I think I clearly was too long. So no, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you so much for sharing the teaser with us. I think there's obviously a lot of questions and concerns that people have in relation to things like the decision for the Biennale to go ahead, the narrative around the Biennale as being rivalist or that it was co-curated by the pandemic, which I know is a number of reviews of the Biennale have chosen to focus on that. But I think it's also interesting to think about these ways, the terms that you use, like reinvention or the adaptability of certain works to the conditions of production, but also the kind of bricolage approach that maybe was taken at different moments in the exhibition. And many biennales chose not to go forward last year, including Helsinki Biennial, Biennial, which will hopefully open in June of this year. But I think this decision to go ahead rather than to stall the exhibition, I think, was a very brave decision. And I know there's been a number of comments about that, including from Taru Topola, who's the co-curator of the Helsinki Biennial, who said it was amazing how you turn catastrophe into a kind of a blossoming or a reimagining space. But if I can bring all three of you together now, perhaps perhaps to look at each other, to say hello, and look at the screen.
Hello.
And we do have a number of questions, and I from members of the public. So I want to make sure that we get to those questions. But I think firstly, I would maybe like to ask a general question, and maybe given that Gabi has curated, I mean, maybe the oldest of the three biennials, and actually also co-curated the Sao Paulo Biennial, but perhaps to think about those two biennials, or biennials more generally, as institutions in and of themselves, which is a term that you used in order to somehow inscribe its structure of organization. But I'm wondering if beginning with you, Gabi, and then to Nav and Rebecca, if there was something that could be learned from these institutions, maybe into the present moment in time, and interview why do we need biennials, and why are they many people calling for them to be even more important now than before the pandemic, or if you have a message to share with us around what we have learned from these institutions.
Yeah, you know, I come from Johannesburg, of course, where we don't have a Biennale, but we used to have one, which was the Johannesburg Biennale in '95 and '97 respectively, and then they stopped, and I kind of did not get the chance to see any of them, and I encountered both of them via stories from different people and anecdotes and text. And for a long time, I was quite, obsessed, and less so now, about the Johannesburg Biennale as a phantom limb of the art world in South Africa in general. So I would see also the work that we did with Center for Historical Reenactment as trying to kind of inhabit that phantom. And so I came from those kind of experiments and into I mean, I've also curated a kind of like a failed Biennale after that in Cape Town, which we call Cape 07, which I think for me was the one of the biggest lesson, because it was trying to kind of revive a Biennale by not calling it a Biennale. So I've always been interested in these things that kind of also fall apart, and what else becomes possible because they are not there. And this is how I went to Sao Paulo, and I mean, I often don't like to compare the two, but I think they're interesting kind of examples, because one happens in a much bigger city, which is Sao Paulo, and much bigger than. I think Sao Paulo is a Biennale of the people of Brazil and neighboring countries, and I think the Berlin Biennale is more like a Biennale also of the art world in a way. So for me, those things were really, they were stuck, kind of differences, and what was very interesting for me in Sao Paulo is the amount of energy and input that is put on the education, and just like the amount of school buses that come to see the Biennale from all over Brazil, that as curators we needed to create education material way in advance, so that the schools can have access to this. I mean, of of course, I think, you know, I was also in Sao Paulo, I was lost in translation most of the time. So I had to kind of invent ways of listening. And in a way, Berlin is an international city in that I didn't quite experience that so intensely. So I felt like arriving in Berlin, which is a city that I kind of knew, and I had engaged with the city and some institutions, including the Berlin Biennale before, that I was there was a platform for me to land in a way which was not the same as in Sao Paulo. I think for me, Berlin has a big opportunity really to really kind of to really kind of understand what it is, because in a way, I think the question I was asked the most was if I was based in Berlin now, or if I would be based in Berlin forever. So there's this understanding that people come and people stay, and it was of course never my idea. So I was quite aware that I'm also coming in as an outsider, which is also often the case, and also not wanting to kind of destabilize whatever things have been happening then, but thinking about how really even the institution itself could start to resemble what the city is, or what the city is known for, and also how can we as a team try to impress that or infect that within the organization itself. And I think it's important for any organization of a large scale to be reflective of the nature of the city that it's in.
Thank you. Would Nav or Rebecca like to respond to that, or would you like me to pitch some of the questions from our audience to you? Instead, I will let you decide.
Well, I have to admit, I don't know.
They're very complicated questions. Sorry?
But, I don't know exactly how to answer the question. I suppose a couple of things that I sort of realized, because the GIBAC is run by basically a very basic infrastructure, like a small Kunsthalle team. And I suppose you get a sense of really like the fragility of infrastructure. And I think like, something like GIBAC, but I think many sort of similar organizations are actually in a very sort of precarious situation, probably not helped by sort of what's happening in the world right now. And I think that's kind of a shame. And I suppose like for places like Gothenburg to have something like this, I think I get the sense, because it's a smaller city. I mean, I think the Nordic region doesn't have big cities anyway, but it's one of those things that sort of helps places like that feel connected, so they feel sort of connected to other scenes and other places and other sort of conditions of practice, and I think there's something sort of really valuable about that, So that's probably what I would sort of say about it. Yeah.
Yeah, me regarding the situation in Riga, I would say that there has been many attempts in Riga to have a contemporary art center that always failed. Like all of these attempts for different reasons, maybe be political or financial, never succeeded. And somehow the biennial, now it's only its second edition, but manages to give a ground for artists not only from Latvia but from the whole Baltics and the region, to have a platform of visibility as well. And that's something that when some institutions fail at being there, at being at that point, biennials can take over. And I know that this is a very strong uh, aim and object of its mission, is to also provide like a platform for the contemporary art scene and the creators in general. Now in terms of biennials, I think that I feel like a survival, like a survival after this biennial that was pretty something, and the whole team with me, it's like a but its agility is something that I could not find in any other institution. And I think this is something that is extremely valuable. This agility to not have any dogmatic understanding of what an exhibition should be or should perform or should provide. And this idea that a new voice comes and new voices come to incarnate it every 2 years is something very dear to me, because my problem with institutions is their tendency to become like very still objects that are focused on a discourse that is at times also a bit enjailing, for those running the exhibitions themselves. No, and I'm running one, so I often find myself a bit stuck in that idea that I need to provide a discourse about what I am, but I also don't want to provide any discourse about what I am in terms of an editorial line or so on. And the biennial, I mean, if you compare the first edition, the edition I did, and the next one, are completely diverse projects that cannot be compared and that allow very different artists to come in as well. My vision is very partial, of course, and what is fantastic is that the next curators and the next team of curators will provide a new insight on the reality that cannot be fully encompassed within one edition. So I think that for that, biennials are very interesting objects, and they are, I think, even more interesting and relevant when they become hybrid and extremely agile and porous and fragile, and when they fail somehow as well.
Mm-hmm. There's a question for you specifically, Rebecca, that's thanking you for your presentation, but also asking you that they're curious about some of the curatorial gestures and where you adapted initial pre-COVID artist proposals as things fell apart, such as the Felicia Atkinson project, as well as the Augustus Serapinas work. Do you see these gestures and, say, the film walk in connection with a kind of performative power that they speak on behalf of, in the sense of creating within the exhibition a kind of like pathos or a mourning voice, a voice of mourning?
No, I think the works themselves were a voice of vitality, even in their transformation. They were really, they had a sense of metamorphosis. They were just not surrendering. I couldn't go through all the works, but you have to imagine that 85-90% of the works had to be reimagined or transformed. Or Marguerite Mo, for example, was supposed to be a very important sculpture representing a marine mammal in the middle of this space, and we could not have it. And instead of this object, we had someone telling you about the story of what you were supposed to see there, and kind of fostering and occupying your imagination to make that object and that artworks come to life. I think that in no means this was a mourning process. This was a very alive process that was just accepting to build with new tools that were at times the void, the ghosts, the absences, but finding them as relevant as exercise of power and permanence that art objects can sometimes incarnate. But we were not afraid of mourning. We were not afraid of death. We were not afraid of the death of past plans. And I think there were more to be found in the architecture, and the ruins that were there. And so in the exhibition, I guess you could never tell if you were in the renovation site or in a ruin, and I like this liminal space where you can't tell which world it belongs to. So this state of opacity was very important and interesting for me, but it was a healing process, maybe more than a mourning process. Mourning belongs to healing as well, but I think healing is more accurate in our case.
Thank you. And I have a question specifically for Nav, relating to the specificity of the Nordic region. How do you see this kind of recent interest by artists and curators with esotericism and occultism, considering that Northern European societies, especially the Nordic region, are mostly secular? So the question of secularity and this esoteric spiritualism, and how these kind of cohabit with one another. And that's a question from Stefan Gurek.
Well, I would say myself, I'm not massively interested in it. I mean, just to sort of elaborate, because I think obviously there is a sort of interest in sort of different ways of thinking and sort of constructing different realities. I understand that, and I suppose like what I'm interested in is basically the question of what people can and can't do, because I suppose like as somebody who identifies as a non-believer, when you make that sort of first decision, you also have to sort of, it comes along with a whole other set of questions around like what kind of non-believer are you? And that in a certain sense was my sort of starting point for this biennial, because very often sort of secularity is actually about taking belief out of the question to make sort of decisions on quite difficult or complex things, So things like, making decisions on whether you allow things like abortion rights or certain kinds of freedom of expression, but about whether you are fine about other people having their own belief system, which I do, because I understand belief systems as being as a sort of aspect of culture. Just like sort of contemporary art is an aspect of culture, or food is an aspect of culture. I also see sort of belief systems as also being a sort of aspect of culture in that way. So so I suppose like my point is that it's important that that we have a sort of a situation of inclusivity, but without necessarily any sort of one dominant way of sort of living, of coexisting, let's say. So that's is probably what I would say about it. I think it's interesting because I've worked also with artists who looked at these things, like whether it be occult or other kinds of belief systems. But I'm interested in it when it's sort of acknowledged as a kind of aspect of culture in that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I have a question from Mike Watson, which I'm going to adapt a little bit, and maybe direct it towards all of you, maybe. And it's looking at the relationship between secular cultures, but also how the arts comes up against the obstacle of art itself being fundamentally tied to power structures or institutional power structures. And there's a quotation by John Berger, which is articulated as, the art of any era serves to support the ideology of the working class. Does this not make the museum per se a signifier of power, not dissimilar to the church, or a biennale, not too dissimilar to the church, with its own set of ideals that bias research? And the question is like how to overcome this, how to overcome the power of these kind of power structures. You don't have to. Do you want to bite? Anybody want to bite?
I mean, I think that's it's a big subject. It's a big debate and not a new one. But I suppose like I find the comparison between a museum and a church a difficult one, or an unconvincing one. I sort of get it, but I don't know if I find the sort of really an equivalent. But I do think also like institutions, it's important that institutions in general don't become kind of monocultural spaces. You know, there should be a sort of diversity of different kinds of institutions supporting different kinds of things. So I think I would say sort of how I sort of understand institution in this question is a bit too sort of monolithic somehow, you know. But like I find it hard to sort of relate museums to religious structures because you know there's no, in my mind I don't really see like the equivalence of a deity or a divinity or experiences of the transcendental kind, or you know, so it's a difficult analogy.
I think the link that's been made is around kind of power and authority, and the kind of maybe sometimes the invisible power of authority that both museums and the church, more generally speaking, may align itself. And I think also historically within a kind of a certain history of modernism, a certain history of museums and exhibitions, the white cube, and the question of religiosity and the sacred, and reverence towards the work and so forth, which via Brian O'Doherty and many authors subsequently. So there may be some maybe inherent logic to that interrelationship between the historical paradigm of the modernist museum and its relationship with power and reverence. Not that I'm asking the question, but I'm just trying to find a way to maybe link it more directly to the question of power and a history of exhibitions, and them being entangled somewhat in terms of authority.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's related to what Foucault also called the heterotopic spaces, and this idea of a set of rules and behaviors and spirituality that are kind of incarnated by certain spaces and certain behaviors that you're supposed to also incarnate. And I think in this sense, the history of exhibitions and the history of museums is extremely violent, I think, towards the humans, in terms of power structures, in terms of relationships, in terms of knowledge and know-how, in terms of distributions of the discourse, distribution of the space, distribution of the Yeah, the authority and the presence. And this is something that I had worked on a lot when I did this show with Tino Segal, of course, for whom these questions are extremely important, like this regime of the presence that we try to question while emptying completely the Palais Tokyo and having only the original historical walls of the Palais Tokyo and only humans, 400 humans inhabiting that space. And what happens when there is no set of rules that is really well known or shared, because no one knows the rules of Tino Segal apart from himself. And what happened? What kind of objects are we creating then? And I think this is exactly what Tino is interested in: how to dismantle the construction and the processes of building rules that we kind of all agree to without really agreeing to. And this is also what I tried to do with Riga, to come back to a more concrete example that I discussed, by accepting like moments where, which could seem anecdotic, but for me were quite important in terms of opening up to what an artwork is and what we refer as valuable as well, with this replacement of works by Ugo Rondinone, who becomes like a reproduction on a plywood. And is it a work or is it not a work? Is it this replacement? Is it acceptable? Like what happens when this the visitors become actors and perform really like a huge artworks outside the hangars and like really take the stage? What happened when we have no ways of stopping the pigeons for coming on the works and just making their nest and living their life and stealing the hay? I mean, what happens when ecosystems that are outside the traditionally very waterproof walls of the institutions? What happens then? And this is what I'm very interested in, and this is what I'm thinking about all the time. It's very obsessive. It's like, how can I, as a curator, try to overcome this moment of authority and this kind of display that is a display of violence as well, that has been performed through the centuries? And how can I rethink about the place and the positions of visitors or regardeurs, as Marcel Duchamp would put it, which might be more interesting than a visitor, and stop treating them as guests and stop treating myself as a host, and try to work on a more grounded and more equal ground.
Thank you. Gabi. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time, but I just wanted to have my 2 cents, because I think of course the 10th Berlin Biennale was also constructed around the idea of questioning power, if one is able to change the power of power, and to question, you know, hierarchies, and of course my interest in institutions. And I think with the work of Dineo Bobabe of Occult Instability, which in part was inspired by a book by Bessie Head with that title, A Question of Power, which also has been a book that has really been working also, that has been really important for me, because when Bessie Head wrote this book in '74, she was not in a good state of mind, and at the same time able to kind of produce a book that is very difficult to read, actually, with such a poignant kind of title, and bringing this, of course, you know, we don't need another hero, is that question of power in itself. But like, if I would just, you know, maybe just answer you know, the question in one word, like, can we overcome the power of power? Like in my in my experiences, I mean, the answer is no. I mean, you know, but at the same time, the world has changed. Like, I think the past year has produced a different kind of way of maybe asking that question. and hopefully the answer is changed.
Thanks, Gabi. I'm now going to ask our fourth guest, Xuan Lai, to join us. Xuan, are you there? Yeah. And for those of you who haven't met each other, João is the chief curator for exhibitions like Chiasma, and amongst many other achievements and many exhibitions and projects, is actually also the co-curating the forthcoming 14th Baltic Triennial, which opens in Vilnius in June, I believe. But I invite João to respond to your presentations and maybe have the last word. I also find it's so over to you.
First, thank you, Paul, and thanks Gabi, Rebecca, and Nav for the presentations. It's really a pleasure to be among friends and colleagues whose work I really admire. I'm not fully sure if I'm going to wrap up or to further complexify or open up. I'll try to highlight some ideas, surely, also not only from today, but also of the talk or the ensemble of talks of 2 weeks ago, because there are quite a few points that I found quite relevant. And I'll also, in a way, wrap up with my own experience at the Triennial and this, because it sort of leads towards the reflection, the current ongoing reflection about biennials, their past and possibly their future and their standing. So in a way, I guess today's presentations and also 2 weeks ago, they all sort of engaged with the biennial as a space of experimentation. So that would sort of feed into why the biennial is still a valid sort of platform. Also as a propositional space, and very often also embedded in local histories and contexts, which is also sort of unique mission or unique kind of position the biennial sort of occupy. Then also important, even though today wasn't so much addressed, but Taru really emphasized this idea of the repetition or the reactualization that the biennial structure or the biennial model kind of has structurally. And this ties in also with something that Marty mentioned that really interests me, which is this idea of layering, which echoes especially towards the local audiences. For example, as Gabi mentioned, the São Paulo Biennial is really extraordinary in that. Or then in more expert art audiences, people that have repeated attendances of different editions of the biennial. I think it's quite important, this idea of repetition. And then Taru also emphasized something which was interesting to use today as a guideline, which is the specific relationship or the special relationship of the biennial as a proposal with the present. And it goes kind of both ways. There's this sort of need to kind of bring something new, which is maybe not the most interesting side of this equation, but there is also the idea of what's urgent to bring onto the table. And there I kind of find another possibility of finding validity for the biennial, which is the urgency might also lie in the idea of distribution or redistribution. And in the sense, like the biennial is this kind of heightened or intense moment that really captures visibility, of course, in different degrees, given the scale, but at least from a local point and then to different degrees growing internationally, it is an event that kind of captures the attention. And so using that opportunity to redistribute not only visibility, but also the resources that are being put into the realization of the event can also be, when used, as a redistribution tool or as an opportunity to do otherwise, an important way of adding or feeding the biennial still today with as a valuable and a valid sort of proposal. And I guess another way of looking at the validity of the biennial is, in retrospect, looking how its questions or its positions kind of still echo, or what they still kind of offer today. And so it was interesting to listen to 3 presentations and to kind of rethink how they kind of still function. And it was really, of course, productive to think that they work very well. And even maybe they are more urgent today than what they were. In the sense, there's also this idea of a possible anticipation of critical questions. So, for example, in the case of Nav, I think the question of this myth around national monocultures is really essential. I don't know if more now than before, but surely as much now as before. And then, for example, Gabi's interest in complexity and contradiction and rejection of kind of monolithic systems of knowledge, its traction is totally still very current. I also found in Gabi's case, and drawing from this idea of visibility, that the appropriation of a pop song title was a really inspiring and amazing gesture, in the sense that it really hints in a very generous way to what the biennial is kind of trying to do, which is really open up and make the biennial forum as really a democratic kind of space. So that for me was really, really amazing. One thing I must say, I didn't visit Gothenburg Biennial. I did visit Berlin and RIBOCA, so I'm a bit at a loss. So I'm mostly focusing on the kind of themes or the works rather than the experience, which is something I'm also quite interested in. And also that something that biennials, as for example in the case of Rebecca, might really offer this kind of other means or other ways of experiencing art. And then in the case of RIBOCA and Sedentary Adult Blooms, for me it's kind of very special. I was really privileged because I was able to visit it, and it was really an event that very few people could visit, not in terms of numbers, because it was quite well attended, but in the sense the ordinary suspects, meaning us and our colleagues, couldn't really come. So I feel really privileged to have seen, because it was quite a particular case in terms of exhibition making in sort of biennial, but also outside of the biennial context. And also regarding our work at the Baltic Triennial, it also kind of shares this condition in different ways, but it shares this context which is highly insecure and filled with different sort of problematics that were not present before. And yeah, just to summarize a little bit and to conclude, our first kind of move in the context of the Baltic Triennial was to think a little bit about the origin. And this was something that Matt also mentioned in his kind of really thorough mapping of the history of EVA International. It's like, I guess the origin is quite key as a sort of a marker or as a sign of why, and again, the validity of the event is there. And in a similar way to EVA, the Baltic Triennial emerged out of a coalition of artists. So it was totally artist-led. But it also reacted to a kind of a context in the region where those kind of large-scale international events focused on media specificity or languages. And the artists that kind of formed the triennial wanted to go against that and to present a shared forum for any kind of languages and practices. So that was kind of key. Another element of the why of the existence of the triennial is that it also was used, and it also kind of commemorated the 40th anniversary of the inclusion of Lithuania in the USSR. So of course that was a sort of ideological mission also of the triennial. So that was a little bit our starting point. And then drawing a little bit from Rebecca's case, how to work and how to kind of create something out of this particular context, which really presents many challenges to the way this sort of events were kind of built. We have challenges, but very different ones. Rebecca basically needed to totally reshape something that was already structured and designed. We didn't, in the sense that we immediately had to incorporate the challenges of the pandemic into how we're thinking about the triennial. The only thing we had was a focus, and we're not really working with a theme, but rather a geopolitical focus. So we're looking at Central Eastern Europe and then a few other territories. This clear-cut mapping a bit more problematic, such as the Caucasus. And we did that also looking at the history. So that was the original mission of the triennial, which had somehow blurred a little bit with the evolution of the event, but also because it was something that the territory and the region kind of asked for, to have some sort of internal platform. With the decades, throughout the decades, many other events happen. For example, the Helsinki Biennial is now coming, but there's already, of course, the Photo Month Biennial in Tallinn, and then Survival Kit and RIBOCA in Riga. So in a way, the triennial now is freer to do other things, and not necessarily for this need of the region to be the main and the only kind of international event. Yeah, just to sum it up, and also to draw a little bit from Gabi's plural kind of positioning, we're also looking at the territory not as a kind of unique or homogeneous territory. We're kind of using the image of the kaleidoscope to this kind of superimposition of different agencies and different narratives. And then one really key point that Marty also mentioned, that we've been really struggling in a productive way, is this regional focus and yet wanting to still be international. And this not in a sort of globalized, anonymous kind of art discourse, but rather international in the sense that we still foster dialogue and conversations that transcend national borders. So maybe I close, and that's why I was kind of saying that more than summing up, I'm kind of trying to open up further questions, even though Marty already kind of hinted, but I think they weren't as visible as they could. And it also ties in, for example, with Nav's question of the monolithic national identity. So, like, how can we work in a biennial, which is naturally a kind of international platform, in a local way, or something which is locally grounded, without falling into localism? Or in another way, how can we work in a way that fosters transnational collaboration without erasing locality? Or the final formulation at this point would be how to counter uniform globalism without feeding kind of nationalistic discourses. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Nav. Thank you, Gabi.
Thank you.
Hopefully this is the a beginning of a much longer conversation, and in other times and in better times, we will all gather together in Helsinki and share food together, share sweat together, share each other's breath together. But for now, I want to thank you all very much for spending some time with us in this interface, which I know is a very difficult interface, depending on, regardless of where you are in the world. But thank you, Sean, for a really considered and generous response to the three presentations. And I also want to thank all the guests that we've had over the last few weeks that have joined us to talk about the importance of biennials and the importance of biennials as a form of resistance to some of the things that you've mentioned: neo-nationalism, the rise of neo-fascism, neo-nationalism, and so forth. And so I'm wondering if you could all just give each other a round of applause. And there's lots of great comments on the comment list to say thank you all speakers for such inspiring presentations and so forth. But take care, everybody, and see you somewhere soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.